Hello class, and welcome to the second lecture for this week, where we continue to talk about the elasticity of demand and supply. Last lecture we looked mostly at the elasticity of demand and the factors that influence its elasticity, and today we're going to be looking at the elasticity of supply. I'm also going to be introducing you to a couple of other elasticities called cross elasticity and also income elasticity. If you can remember what I told you about how the price elasticity of demand is influenced by the availability of substitutes and also what proportion of income the product carries. Well, how those two factors influence the elasticity of demand. This is a way of analyzing and quantifying the effect of the price of substitutes and the effect that income has on the elasticity of demand. And we'll look into that first. So let's talk about cross elasticity, and then later we're going to talk about income elasticity. When we talk about cross elasticity, what we mean is that we are measuring how the demand for a product changes when the price of a substitute product or a complementary product changes. And whether and in what direction it changes. And so remember what I said about how the elasticity of a product, the price elasticity, is affected by the availability of substitutes. This is demonstrated in this concept called cross elasticity of demand, and that is basically the percentage change in quantity demanded of a good over the percentage change in the price of a substitute or complementary good. So let's look at an example here, because I think examples help. Now, burgers and pizzas are substitute goods. If you are going out to town for the night and you want to eat junk food, if you eat a burger, you're probably not going to eat a pizza. There's only so much junk food your stomach can handle. And likewise, if you eat pizza, you will actually probably not eat a burger. You would be a very fat person if you ate a burger and pizza. They're not complementary goods, they're substitute goods. You're going to eat one or the other. Now, if you go out to town and you realize that the price of burgers is really expensive for whatever reason, you're probably going to buy pizza instead. Likewise, if burgers are very cheap, the quantity demanded of pizza will go down. This is why the price of burgers at 2 and 1 actually influences how many customers go into Pizza Hut to buy pizza, because they're substitute goods. Now let's suppose, for example, the price of a burger falls by 10%. That means more people are going to buy burgers, doesn't it? The quantity demanded for burgers will increase. But because they're buying burgers, they're going to be buying less pizza. More people will buy burgers and less people will buy pizza. And so we're saying here that as the price of the burger falls, the quantity demanded of pizza decreases by 5%. So let's look at the cross elasticity of demand. What is the change in quantity demanded for pizza? Well, it's 5%. What is the change in price of the substitute good, burger? It's 10%. So the cross elasticity of demand for pizza in reference to burgers is 0.5. It's a positive value, it's above 0, and therefore you know that pizza and burgers are substitute goods. If it was a negative value, then it would actually mean that it is a complementary good. Now, remember, unlike with price elasticity, where I said you take the absolute value and you ignore negative signs and minus signs, you can't do that when determining cross elasticity. So if the price of the burger falls and the quantity of pizza demanded falls, then you've got to keep in account both the negative signs there. And that will mean that your cross elasticity is positive because you have a negative value over a negative value, and therefore you know that the two products are substitute goods. So let's have a look at this on a graph. Okay, no, the graph comes in the next slide. But just remember that if the two goods are substitute goods, the cross elasticity of demand will be positive. If a price falls for a substitute, the quantity demanded for a good will decrease. Likewise, if the price of a substitute goes up, the quantity demanded for the good will go up. And so the quantity demanded of the good and the price of the substitute, they move in the same direction. Now, if we're talking about a complementary good, the cross elasticity of demand will be negative. If a complementary good, if the price falls, that will mean the quantity demanded of your product will increase. Likewise, if the price of your complementary good increases, then the quantity demanded of your product will decrease. They move in opposite directions. So let's look at this graphically. So on the right here we have the demand curve for pizza, and on the y-axis we've got the price, how much it costs to buy a pizza, and on the bottom we've got quantity, the number of pizzas that are sold every day, and it's counted in the thousands. So this is for a probably very big market. Let's say this is the market for all of Iraq, let's say. Well, what's going to happen if the price of burgers falls? Well, a lot of the Kurds and the Arabs of Iraq, they're going to be demanding a smaller quantity of pizza, and instead what they're going to do is they're going to buy burgers instead because they are substitutes. So as the price of a burger falls, the demand for pizza will decrease. And because the supply line for pizza stays the same, just because 2-in-1 Burger lower their prices, it doesn't mean that suddenly Pizza Huts are going to close down. No, there will still be the same value, there will still be the same supply, but because the demand is decreasing, so will the quantity demanded, the quantity consumed. And because it's a positive cross elasticity, you know that burgers and pizzas are substitutes. Now, what's going to happen if it moves in the other direction? Now, soda or fizzy drinks, Cokes, they are complements to pizza. They're not substitutes, they're complements. Just because you drink a can of Coke, that doesn't mean you're not going to buy pizza. In fact, you're more likely to buy pizza because everyone knows that Coke and pizza go together. That's what you drink. You have something salty and then you drink something sweet. They are complementary goods. Well, what's going to happen if the price of the soda falls? If suddenly Coke is a lot cheaper, let's say it goes down to being free, more people are going to buy pizza because they've got cheaper Coke to go with it. Well, that means the demand for pizza is going to increase. And so, once again, because the supply of pizza stays the same, and that will mean that the quantity demanded will increase. So, as the price falls for the complementary good, the quantity demanded for your good will increase. And so the cross elasticity of demand is negative, and that means the two products, soda and pizza in this regard, are complementary. They are not substitute goods. So we've talked a little bit about cross elasticity, and there's going to be a question on that in your assignment. Let's now turn to income elasticity of demand. Remember what I said about how one of the things that influences the elasticity of demand is the price elasticity of demand is actually income, and how if a product if the cost of a product is a greater proportion of someone's income, then that's going to actually influence the elasticity of that demand. It's going to become more elastic if it's a larger proportion. And likewise, we also talked about whether it is a good or a luxury. And if a good is more a luxury than a necessity, it's further up Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of need, then the elasticity of demand will be greater. There will be more elasticity. The slope will be smaller. And so with these two things, you've got to realize that income actually influences the price elasticity of demand, because if people's incomes go up, then all goods will be a smaller proportion of income, and that will influence the elasticity. And if incomes go up, then there's going to be more demand for luxurious goods rather than whereas income doesn't have the same effect on necessities and needs. So how do we do this? Well, the income of elasticity of demand is basically a measure of the percentage change of a good in quantity demanded over the percentage change in average incomes for the markets that you're analyzing. So if it's a luxury item, it will have a high income elasticity. So if suddenly everyone in Erbil suddenly had their incomes doubled overnight, I don't know what would happen to make that happen, but let's say everyone's incomes doubled, and so suddenly I was earning $500 a month. What would happen? Well, it probably means that throughout Erbil, lots of people are going to want to buy Toyota Land Cruisers or Range Rovers, because these are luxury cars. And so the quantity demanded of these high-end cars will go up significantly, probably more so than even doubling the percentage change in income. So what this means is that as people's incomes increase, then the quantity demanded increases as well. Now, there are other goods which are not considered luxurious goods or superior goods, but they are what we would call inferior goods. So an example of this would be a Kia Pinto. Now, a Kia Pinto, it's a decent car. It will get you from A to B, but it's not a chick magnet. It's not going to help Hummer pick up the chicks. And so, if suddenly everyone gets an income rise in Erbil, they're not going to be thinking, let's go buy Kia Pintos. No, they're going to be thinking, let's buy the Ferraris. Let's buy the Toyota Land Cruisers. And so, as incomes go up, demand for Kia Pintos actually goes down, and the income elasticity of demand is negative. So we've talked a little bit about the income elasticity of demand, and we've also talked about the cross elasticity of demand and how those influence the price elasticity of demand. We're now going to be looking at the price elasticity of supply. And so this is quite easy. It's basically the same as looking at the price elasticity of demand, but now we're looking at on the supply curve. We're trying to determine how steep is the supply curve, how a percentage change in the quantity supplied compares with a percentage change in price. So you can have elastic and inelastic supply curves, just as you can have elastic and inelastic demand curves. So a perfectly elastic supply curve will be a horizontal supply line, where just like with the perfectly elastic demand curve, an almost 0% change in price occurs when there is a huge change in quantity supplied. Now, if it is elastic, the supply will mean that there is the percentage change in quantity supplied is greater than the percentage change in price. And if it's unit elastic, it means that the percentage change in quantity supplied equals the percentage change in price. So it's exactly the same as looking at the elasticity of demand, but this time we're looking at the supply curve. If it's inelastic, then that means the supply curve is going to be steep, and the percentage change in quantity supplied is going to be less than the percentage change in price. And if it's perfectly inelastic, that means your supply curve is a perfectly straight line. And that means that you can change the price as much as you like, but there will be no change to the quantity supplied. So let's look at this graphically. You've got right here a perfectly elastic supply line. Now, a small rise in the price is going to mean that there will be no overlap with the supply line. So if it's a close to 0% change in price, there will be a very large change in the quantity supplied by a very large amount. So so this would be perfectly inelastic. Now let's look at a more normal supply curve. In this case, we're looking at books. So remember what I said about J.K. Rowling selling books, and we talked about the demand for Harry Potter books in the last lecture. Now we're looking at the supply line. Now let's say that she is currently selling her Harry Potter books for $95 per book, and the quantity supplied is that she is willing to supply at that price is 900 million books per year. Now, if the price was to rise by 10% to $105, then suddenly she is going to be willing to supply 110 million books per year. And so what happens is with a 10% increase in the price of book, there's a 20% increase in the quantity supplied. And so here we can see that the supply curve is very shallow, it's not very steep. This is elastic supply. Now let's look at unit elastic supply. This is where the rise in price of fish in this regard, so it's gone from being $9.50 to $10.50 per pound, pound being a weight, not a currency from the UK or from Egypt. And that means the quantity demanded, pounds per day, goes from 95 to 105. So a 10% rise in the price of fish means that there is a 10% rise in the quantity supplied of fish. And so when we do the price elasticity of supply, it's going to equal 1. And that will mean that the supply of fish has a unit elasticity. Let's now look at an inelastic supply. And so an example of this is hotel rooms. If let's say that there's currently 100 hotel rooms in Shaklawa, there's actually far more than that, but let's say the price of a hotel room was to drop suddenly. That means there's still going to be 100 hotel rooms tomorrow. The number of hotel rooms in the short term isn't really affected by a change in price. And if likewise, if the price goes up, that doesn't mean suddenly there's going to be lots more hotel rooms. In the long run, more people are going to want to build hotel rooms if they think they can make more money off it. But in the short term, it's fairly inelastic. We'll talk more about that later. But currently, there is an average price of a hotel room for a night as being $90 a night. And there is 95,000 hotel rooms throughout Iraq. Now, what's going to happen if the average price of a hotel room goes up by 20%? It goes up to $110 per night. Suddenly, the quantity supplied will go up to 105,000 rooms every night. It doesn't change that much. There might be a few people thinking, well, I can rent out the extra rooms in my house because I think I can make a bit more money. So there's some elasticity, but not a lot. So you can see that basically for a 20% rise in the price, the quantity of hotel rooms supplied only goes up by 10%. In this case, the price elasticity of supply is less than 1. It is 0.5, 10% over 20%. And so we can say that the elasticity of supply is inelastic. So if it's perfectly inelastic, we're going to the absolute extreme. And an example of something that would be perfectly inelastic would be land. If the price of land goes up, that's not going to change the amount of land for sale. So if we're looking at, because you can't create more land. So we're looking here at the price of a lot being an ardhiya. It's the area where you can build a house. And so the quantity is 100. Now, what's going to happen here? What if the price was to go up considerably? Let's say that suddenly it goes up by a small percentage, but here 10%. Is that going to change the quantity supplied? Not at all, because there's only so many lands available. And so we would say this is inelastic. The price elasticity of supply is perfectly zero. And there's very few examples where that is actually the case. So now that we've talked about price elasticity of supply generally, let's talk now about what influences the elasticity, what influences the gradient of that curve. And there's really two main influences for price elasticity for supply. They are production possibility and storage possibility. So let's first talk about production possibility. If you can up the production or slow down the production of whatever the product is, then there will be elastic supply. If it's harder to slow down or speed up production, then there will be inelastic supply. So an example here would be something like oil. That would be something that we would consider an inelastic supply. The reason for that, I don't know how much oil Kurdistan is producing every day. I think it's somewhere around 1 million barrels, approaching that number. Now, currently, the dollar, you're currently selling the oil at $20 a barrel, I believe. What's going to happen if the price of oil shoots up to $100? Well, you're going to want to produce more, aren't you? You're going to want to supply more because you can make more money. But is the KRG going to do that? Well, no, because there's only so much production potential for oil. There's only so much oil with the oil fields you have that you can produce every day. And so, even though the price goes up, the quantity that you supply doesn't actually change that much, and it's controlled by the production possibility. For something, another thing would be farming, food. Now, what happens if suddenly the price of rice goes up? They discover that rice actually cures cancer, and suddenly more people demand rice, and the price of rice shoots up to being $20 a kilo. Well, is there suddenly going to be more rice being supplied in the world? Well, no, because there's only so many farms that can produce rice. There's only so much land, and there's only so much land that has been developed to produce rice. So in that case, the production possibility would be inelastic as well. But things where you can easily up production or slow down production in response to demand, well, that's going to have an elastic supply. Now, anything that has a fixed quantity, so something like oil, or maybe gold, or silver, or iron, things where there's basically, it's usually used for natural resources, where there's a finite amount of the resource in the world. Well, you can up production maybe a little bit, but not a lot, because you're controlled by how much is available. And so that will have an inelastic supply. The other thing that can influence the elasticity of supply is the time elapsed since price change. Now, let me try and give you an example of this. Oil is an example. As I just said in the last slide, when the price of oil goes up, you're going to want, if you're a seller like the KRG, you're going to want to produce more because you can make more money off selling it. However, you're limited in your production possibilities, so you have inelastic supply. That the following day, if you're producing 1 million barrels a day and selling it for $20, and then the following day the price shoots up to $100 a barrel, you're going to want to produce more, but you can only produce 1 million barrels a day. However, if the price stays high and it stays at $100, what's going to happen? Well, over time, you're going to actually change your production strategy. You're going to build more oil fields. And so as time elapses, as time passes, you can actually produce a higher quantity of the good at the new price. And so the longer you wait after the price change, the supply becomes more elastic. So imagine that we could actually have two supply curves. We could have a short-term supply curve for what is the immediate response to a price change, and we could have a long-term supply curve, how people actually will change how they produce in the future. They'll probably build a new oil field or build a new gold mine or something like that. The other thing that really influences the price elasticity of supply is storage possibilities. Now, if you're a supermarket salesman and you're selling things in your supermarket, and the price of eggs, for example, is normally I don't know, what is it? It's 2,000 dinar for half a dozen eggs, let's say. It's probably a bit more than that. Then there's a change in the economy. Maybe there's an epidemic of chickens or something, and they're laying eggs on everyone's front doorstep every morning. And the price of the eggs goes down to being 250 dinar. It drops by over 1,000% to being 250 dinar for half a dozen eggs. Well, what are you going to do? Well, you probably want to hold the eggs. You don't want to sell them at such a low price, especially if they cost you more to get them, and you want to hold them until the price goes up again. But you can't do that with eggs, can you? Why? Because eggs are perishable goods. They're going to go off within a week. So you need to sell them within a week of getting them, otherwise you need to throw them out. You won't make any money. But something that actually has very good storage potential, that isn't perishable, you can hold it or let it go depending on until you are happy that the price is right for you to sell it. So something like gold, which is not perishable, that actually has an elastic supply once it's been mined. Or another example would be things such as cars or houses. If you're not happy with the price of houses and real estate, you would just hold the house until such time as the value goes up, and then you would sell it. But things which are perishable and you cannot store them for very long, they will have a much more inelastic price elasticity of supply. Another good example of this is actually electricity. Now, I know you can store electricity to a degree in batteries and other things, but actually if we're looking at the entire grid system for an electricity supply for a city, electricity is the only product in the world where the moment it is created, it's also consumed. You can't put electricity on a shelf and wait for a buyer to come along. You create it as people buy it. And so the price elasticity for electricity is very inelastic. You can't up and lower supply of electricity very quickly. So remember, storable goods, things which are not perishable, things which you can keep for a long time, they can be highly elastic. And the other thing you need to remember is the cost of storage of the good can affect the elasticity of the storable good. So let's say, I'm trying to think of an example of something that's very expensive to store. I'll tell you what, an aeroplane. Let's say you own a private jet and you decide you want to sell it, but suddenly the price isn't that good, and so because the demand for private jets is low at that time, and you think, well, I will hold off and wait until the price goes up again. Maybe once the economy is better, maybe once the coronavirus pandemic is over, there'll be more people wanting to buy private jets, and then I will be able to sell it at a higher price. However, the cost of the hangar, that's the warehouse where you keep the aeroplane, you have to pay very high rent at the airport to keep your aeroplane. And so the cost of storage, because it's high, that may influence you to sell it even though the price is low. So if you have high cost of storage, that will actually make the supply of the good more inelastic if there's a high cost of storage. So let's compute the price elasticity of supply. Remember, it's just the same formula as before for the price elasticity of demand, except now we're doing it with the supply curve. So if it's greater than 1, meaning that the change in quantity supplied is greater than the change in price, then we would say it's elastic. If it's equal to 1, it will be unit elastic. It's neither elastic or inelastic. And if it's less than 1, it's inelastic. So here we have an example of a supply curve. So this is actually the supply for flowers in the Middle East. So you can see at point 1, the first equilibrium where the demand curve is over the supply curve, crosses the supply curve. We're currently providing 6 million bouquets of flowers every month. That's a lot of flowers. That's probably the international world market, not just the Middle East. Middle East men don't buy that many flowers for their wives. So the price of a bouquet, when that is the quantity supplied, is $40. Now, what's going to happen when the price of a bouquet of flowers shoots up to $80 per bouquet? Well, every Tom, Dick and Harry is going to think, wow, I can make $80 off a bouquet of flowers. I'm in the wrong business. Quit the day job. We're going into floral arrangements. And suddenly the quantity supplied every month shoots up to 24 million. So, using the midpoints, we know that the percentage change in price is 66.67%. Do you see how we did that? We are using the midpoint to calculate it. So even though it went from $40 to $80, that's not actually a 100% price hike. You can do that if you use the initial price, but the method I'm using for you is actually the midpoint price, and that's so you don't actually get confused as to what direction you need to move in. I just think it's a more foolproof system. So you can use the initial point method where you divide by the initial value rather than the midpoint, but I'm teaching you the midpoint, and so to try and not get confused, use that. So the change is $40. That's $80 minus 40 is $40, and the midpoint is 60. So the percentage change is 67%. Now, the percentage change for quantity, well, the midpoint there is actually between 6 million and 24 million is 15 million bouquets of flowers a month. And you've increased your bouquet of flowers every month by 18 million. So 18 divided by 15 equals 120%. So it's a big number. So how do we then calculate the elasticity? It's very easy. It's the percentage change in the quantity over the percentage change in price. So 120 over 67%. That means the price elasticity of supply is 1.8 to the nearest two significant figures. So that's how we calculate the price elasticity of supply. Very easy calculations. You need your calculator for engineering economics when you do the assignments and the exams, but it's not high-end maths we're doing in this module. I now want to talk to you a little bit about the short and long-term supply and demand. So as I already hinted at before, in the short term, the elasticity of supply is influenced with the amount of time that elapses after a price change. And the same is true for demand. If, let's say, I buy one tank of fuel for my car every week, and that tank of fuel is $40. Now, what happens if the price of a tank of fuel shoots up to $60? Well, next week I might grumble and complain about it, but I'm probably not going to change my behavior. I'm probably still going to fill my car up with one tank of fuel every week. However, in the medium term, maybe after several weeks, I'm thinking I need to change my behavior a bit, and because fuel's so expensive, and I start driving the car less. And so now I'm demanding a little less quantity. And then in the long term, after 2-3 years, I say, you know what, the price is so high for fuel these days, I'm going to trade my car in and I'm going to buy a Toyota Prius, which takes very little in the way of fuel. And so you can see my demand for fuel was initially, in the very short term after a price change, it was very inelastic. But gradually in the long term, it became more elastic. I changed my behavior and I started demanding a smaller quantity. So with supply and demand, in the short term, they tend to be more inelastic. Both of those curves tend to be fairly steep. But in the long term, they both flatten out and become more elastic. Maybe you can imagine that in real time, where you've got a graph and slowly the supply and demand curves are slowly moving flatter after a price change. Now, the way we do this is often we will make two sets of graphs. We will have both a short-term and a long-term supply and demand curve, and maybe the short-term will be immediate effects, and the long-term is we're saying what will this look like for the market in a year's time. And so marketeers and economists, they will actually often be producing two sets of supply and demand curves when analyzing a market. So let's imagine, for an example, you are driving home from UKH one afternoon, reflecting on an interesting and informative economics lecture by Mr. Allen. So there you are in your car, and you can see that person is thinking about how great that lecture was that Mr. Allen gave. Now, as he's driving past a car dealership, he goes past Chihan Motors, and he notices in the showroom the new Toyota Prius. That hybrid car, it's part electrical, it's part gasoline, but it uses very little gasoline. And you think to yourself, boy, that's a nice car, that's a real chick magnet. But you're not willing and you're not able to buy it right there and then. You're thinking, no, I'm not going to buy it now. I'm not going to go in and spend my life savings to buy that nice Prius. And so you're not demanding the Prius at that moment in time. You then pull up to the petrol station and you fill your car up. What do you call petrol here? Benzene? Yeah. You pull up to Khan al Benzene and you fill up your car with petrol. And then the person tells you that will be a huge amount. The price of petrol has gone up to 3,000 dinar per litre. It's a huge amount. The price has really jumped. By the way, that's the price of petrol in New Zealand, just so you know. And you're angry about this, you're furious, but you still need to get home, don't you? And so so you can't get home with an empty tank, so you still buy the fuel and you pay the $70, $80 or whatever it is to fill up the tank. But you get home. And the price stays the same. It stays at 3,000 dinar per litre. And 6 months pass, and what have you done? In that time, you've been thinking the price of fuel is ridiculous. I need to get a more fuel efficient, more economic car. I need to get the Toyota Prius. And so you save up for it, and 6 months pass, and you now have the money for the Toyota Prius. And so you go to Chihan Motors and you buy the Toyota Prius, and now you don't care that fuel costs 3,000 dinar per litre because you're using very little fuel. So do you see what happened? Immediately after the change in price, your demand for fuel was still inelastic. It didn't change. But in the long term, more people are going to buy Priuses and change their behavior and demand less quantity of fuel. And so in the long term, the demand for fuel becomes more elastic. However, in the short term, for the Toyota Prius, there's a price change in the supplementary good of fuel, because even though you buy fuel for a Prius, they're actually supplementary, and you can do this when you do cross elasticity. As the price of fuel goes up, the price of the demand for the quantity demanded of economic cars goes up too. So they're actually substitute goods, not complementary. And so initially, the demand for the Toyota Prius is inelastic. When there's a change in the price of the substitute good, fuel, the quantity demanded of the Toyota Prius doesn't change initially. But after 6 months, more people are going to think, I'm now able and I am willing to buy a Toyota Prius. And so the demand becomes more elastic. Now, at the same time, the overall quantity demanded for fuel decreases. I don't know why there's a yar there, that's a typo, because of the rise in price. But this only happens 6 months later. As I said, in the short term, the quantity demanded of fuel doesn't change the moment the fuel price goes up. You still need to drive your car and get to work every day, and you need time to figure out how you're going to change your behavior. So, this is an example of the short-term elasticity of supply. You've got two very steep curves there. You've got the demand curve and you've got the supply curves. And because they're steep, you know they're inelastic. Now, what happened to make the price of petrol go up? Well, it was probably a situation where there was a decrease in supply. This happens all the time. OPEC, all of the countries that produce oil, they get together at times and they make an arrangement to all cut supply to push the price of petrol up. They work together to make you poorer. And then, so the supply curve shifts from S1 to S2. And so you can see, because there's a very steep line for supply and demand, the price jumps from P1 to P2. Now, in the short term, is the quantity demanded going to change much? Not really, because in 1 week after the price hike, people are still going to be filling up their cars with fuel, regardless. Maybe there might be a small change, but the quantity demanded shifts from being Q1 to Q2. Now, in the long term, however, the demand for petrol will be more elastic. People will stop buying fuel to the same quantity because the price is high, and instead what they're going to do is they're going to be driving less, they're going to be carpooling, or they're going to be buying Toyota Priuses, for example, which need less fuel. And so, even though the price has still gone up the same amount from P1 to P2, the quantity demanded of petrol has actually shifted a much larger amount from Q1 to Q2. And so this could be maybe 6 months to a year after the price change. That would be long-term elasticity. So remember, with short-term and long-term elasticity, in the short term, demand is more inelastic, but in the long term, it becomes more elastic. And this is very noticeable with goods and services that perform a necessary task. So if it's a luxury item or it's a want, if I go to the shop to buy some groceries and I buy a chocolate bar to eat on the way home, and the lady says, oh, that chocolate bar is now $6, I'm going to say, get real, and I'm going to put it back on the shelf. But with the milk and the bread, if she says, oh, the bread is now 3,000 dinar and the milk is now 4,000 dinar, I'm going to be very unhappy with that price. But you know what? I'm still probably going to buy it that day. And then probably next week I will look at changing my behavior. Maybe we can start making bread, or maybe we can get a goat and that can live on my balcony and we can milk that. I don't know. So there's an example there of the more necessary a good or services, the bigger the change from the short-term and long-term demand curves. Now, it's also more noticeable when a substitute good or service is less accessible. So, in the event of going to the supermarket, I go to the supermarket and the price of a chocolate bar is $6. I'm going to say get real, and instead I'm going to get some baklava for myself because the price of baklava has stayed reasonable. So there was a substitute I could go to. There was something else sweet which would have eased my hunger pains. But on the drive home, I need to get fuel for the car, and I find the price of car fuel has gone up to 3,000 dinar a litre. I'm still going to buy it because there's no substitute for gasoline. I can't just fill up my car with Coca-Cola and hope it runs. And so if there's a substitute which is easily accessible, then the effect will be more noticeable, the difference between short and long-term demand. And but of course, in the long term, with fuel, you can actually go to certain substitutes, such as Toyota Priuses. Now, the same effect exists with the supply curve, and the example I'm going to give you is the Rubik's Cube craze of the 1990s. Have you ever played with a Rubik's Cube? It's that little toy that you see at the bottom of your screen. Now, it was developed by a guy from Mensa in the UK, a guy called Rubik, a Jewish guy, and he thought, you know what, I can actually sell these. I've got this idea for a toy, and I think I'm going to sell a few of these and make some money. And so he built a factory that could build these Rubik's Cubes, and they could make 10,000 Rubik's Cubes. This factory, it could build 10,000 Rubik's Cubes every year. I think he could, that it had the capacity of making 10,000 a year, and he was selling them. But very quickly it went viral. Bad choice of word at this time, but the Rubik's Cube went viral. It became a craze, and everyone in the world wanted a Rubik's Cube, and the demand was for millions, and he didn't have the supply capacity to produce them in the millions. And so what happened was the price of a Rubik's Cube shot up. I think at one stage they were being sold for more than $100 each. But that was in the short term. In the long term, he was able to build a larger factory with the help of Milton Bradley and some other toy makers that could actually make millions of these every month. And so, in the short term, the supply was very inelastic, but in the long term it became more elastic. They built a bigger factory to match the quantity demanded. And so this is an example of something where there was no other substitute. There was nothing quite like the Rubik's Cube. You couldn't, I guess you could buy another toy, but really all of the craze in the 1990s was Rubik's cubes. That's what everyone was playing with. And so you weren't going to be the cool kid at school if you went to school with a toy other than Rubik's cube. They were really popular. I remember going to school in the 90s and watching hundreds of kids playing in the playground with these Rubik's cubes. So that's an example of elasticity changing in the short to long term. So I've got a little bit of homework for you. Don't worry, it's not actually homework. This is just supplementary reading. This is available in the library. I hope we can get to, if you're unclear on this, come the exams, look up these pages in the book before the exams. I'm still hoping to get to the library at some stage. The library is still off limits for staff, but as soon as it opens, I will get these books out and I will start scanning pages and putting them on Moodle. In the meantime, you should know that I've also put a couple of videos about elasticity onto the Moodle page besides these lectures. Watch them, and if you still don't understand elasticity, come to me with questions. But this is what you need to know for assignment 3. Thank you everyone, and goodbye.